Welcome, welcome, welcome! It has been a remarkably busy week, which is unfortunate because apparently the world has decided that the correct response to a stressful political environment is to become even more stressful. There are still massive protests taking place in Iran. Tom Brady has somehow ended up with one less ring. And in Britain, the country has once again changed prime ministers, apparently deciding that what it really needed was to speed-run political instability. Liz Truss is out. 45 days. That was the entire experiment. 45 days in Downing Street, which is not technically long enough to establish a successful government, but is apparently plenty of time to destroy one. Her brief tenure was chaotic almost from the beginning. In fact, it became so chaotic that a British tabloid eventually posed a question that sounded less like political journalism and more like something you'd see written on a whiteboard at a frat party. Which will last longer? Liz Truss? Or a head of iceberg lettuce? And incredibly, the lettuce won. Not only did the lettuce survive longer than the Prime Minister, it became a genuine media personality. There was a live stream devoted to it. People watched the lettuce sitting there, existing peacefully, while the British government appeared to be disintegrating around it, and then the lettuce was projected onto the walls of Parliament. The victorious head of lettuce. Honestly, it was beautiful. You had the googly eyes, the little blonde bob, the increasingly absurd spectacle of an ordinary vegetable being treated like a national hero, and I have to give credit where credit is due. From one leaf vegetable lover to another, I respect the commitment. The funny thing is, the lettuce challenge wasn't even the strangest part of the story. Before Liz Truss finally left office, the people around her were dropping like characters in a particularly depressing game of political Jenga. Her Chancellor was fired. That made him the second shortest serving Chancellor in British history. The only persons who had served for less time had at least one major advantage. He was dead. Then her Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, resigned after breaching security procedures by using her personal email to send a government document. Then Truss's own party descended into chaos during a vote over fracking. And at one point, one party leader simply reached the point of saying, "Furious, and I don't care anymore." And honestly, hearing that sentence delivered through a German news outlet somehow made it better. Everything sounds more threatening with a German accent. If someone says, "Nice outfit," you're happy. If someone says, "Nice outfit," you're immediately looking around for somewhere to hide. By this point, any remaining sense of decorum in British politics had been carefully placed into a small box, lowered into the Thames, and waved goodbye. But perhaps the most British moment of the entire collapse came after a contentious interview between a reporter at Downing Street and Conservative MP Steve Baker. The interview ended, the reporter's microphone did not. And the reporter could be heard responding after Baker apparently described one of his questions as stupid. The reporter thanked him. Not sarcastically, not angrily. He thanked him. He essentially said that the question wasn't stupid and that he was perfectly happy to argue with Baker about Liz Truss. Now, to American ears, this can sound strangely polite. And that's because it is. There is something uniquely British about responding to political disagreement by cheerfully thanking the other person before essentially calling them an idiot. It is the sort of behaviour you would expect from someone apologising to the person who just stepped on their foot. "I'm terribly sorry you injured my foot. Thank you so much for the experience." And that brings us to the end of the Liz Truss era. 45 days the lettuce had won, and Britain needed someone new. Enter Rishi Sunak. Sunak inherited a situation that was arguably even worse than the one Truss had left behind. He was now facing severe cuts to public spending, which would be particularly difficult politically, because Sunak is extraordinarily wealthy and has frequently been portrayed as being disconnected from ordinary voters. That perception did not exactly come out of nowhere. A BBC documentary from 2001 resurfaced, showing Sunak while he was still at university. In the clip, he talked about having friends who were working class while explaining that he himself was not. He also described mixing with people from different backgrounds and visiting children from an inner-city state school to encourage them to apply to Oxford. And there is something unintentionally revealing about that. Imagine possessing such an elite education that you can look at systemic inequality and think, yes, but what if everyone simply applied to Oxford? That is one solution. it is not necessarily a good one. It is also not particularly comforting to people struggling with structural barriers, but perhaps the most memorable demonstration of Sunak's alleged distance from ordinary life came later when he attempted to promote a cut in fuel prices by being photographed filling up a car. The problem, it wasn't his car. Now, to be fair, I could probably have identified that immediately. The car was a burgundy Kia Rio. The closest Rishi Sunak is likely to get to a burgundy Kia Rio is telling it that one day, if it works hard enough, it too could become a Rolls-Royce. And then there was Suella Braverman. Remember her? She had resigned as Home Secretary only 6 days earlier after the security breach. And now Sunak had reappointed her, which is certainly one way to begin a new administration. Imagine saying, I'm going to run a completely different government, and then immediately bringing back one of the people who had just left the previous one in disgrace. Braverman is known for her hardline positions on immigration and welfare. In one clip, she described what she saw as a stubborn portion of the population treating welfare as their preferred option rather than getting out and working. She argued for more conditions and more stick to push people into employment. And there is a lot to unpack there, but if you're trying to persuade people that you respect them, perhaps don't describe them using language that makes them sound like animals that need to be trained. And that's coming from me. I arguably respect horses too much. I want horses to feel good about themselves. So Sunak's new government was starting under enormous pressure, but he did have one major advantage. He was following Liz Truss. And when your predecessor's defining achievement was losing a race against lettuce, the bar is not exactly at eye level. Sunak essentially needed to do two things. Don't personally send the economy into another tailspin, and deliver a speech without producing the impression that the teleprompter has suddenly become possessed. Unfortunately, he immediately encountered difficulty with the second one. At the end of his first public address, he said, I will work day in, day out to deliver for the British people. And then came the pause, a strange, uncertain pause, the kind of pause that makes you wonder whether the speaker has forgotten what words are. It looked less like the conclusion of a prime ministerial speech and more like a malfunctioning teleprompter had replaced the final sentence with, have a panic attack. Now, despite all of this, Sunak will probably last longer than Liz Truss. Probably, but Britain remains furious. And as that wonderfully memorable broadcaster put it, I don't care anymore. And honestly, who could blame them? Because somewhere in Britain, there was a head of iceberg lettuce watching all of this unfold and thinking, you people need to get your vegetables together. And now, this full disclosure, I am not a finance guy. I haven't studied finance. I don't understand finance particularly well. Full disclosure, I was once a very amateur national anthem singer. Full disclosure, I used to work at the Olive Garden. Full disclosure, I've never been to a drive-in. Full disclosure, I've always wanted a Boston Whaler. Full disclosure, I had a Q-tip in my ear last night. Full disclosure, I've eaten enough shrimp and grits to last me the next 4 years. Full disclosure, the oysters were not from the East River. Full disclosure, I crushed a Kind bar about 10 minutes ago. Full disclosure, I'm a cookie guy. Full disclosure, go Gators. Full disclosure, there is an action figure of me in my office made out of fondant. Moving on, our main story tonight concerns crime. Batman's adversary and, apparently, Batman's kink. Come on, you don't dress a grown man in a rubber suit, give him a gadget belt, and tell me this is entirely about avenging his parents. Grow up. With the midterm elections approaching, crime has become a major feature of Republican political advertising, and one particular policy has repeatedly appeared at the centre of those attacks. Bail reform. The ads are remarkably consistent. Do you feel safe? Then they mention a Democratic candidate. Then they say that person wants to eliminate cash bail. Then comes the frightening implication. Dangerous criminals will be released. People will be back on the streets. Neighbourhoods will become unsafe. And finally, usually a body bag, because apparently nothing says nuanced policy debate like a body bag. You could make anything frightening that way. Lock McStuffins is not a particularly terrifying children's programme. But if you end the episode with a body bag labelled McStuffins Morgue, you're going to have some explaining to do at bedtime. The reason these ads matter is that the United States has been experimenting with bail reform for years. Since 2011, at least 19 states and dozens of local jurisdictions have adopted some form of reform designed to reduce reliance on cash bail. But as crime rates have risen in certain categories, critics have increasingly blamed those reforms. They say eliminating or reducing cash bail has created a revolving door. They say dangerous people are being released. They say politicians are refusing to protect the public. And when a political message gets repeated enough times, it can start to sound like established fact, even when it isn't. Cash bail is complicated, but the basic system is simple enough. If you're arrested and want to remain out of jail while awaiting trial, a court may require you to provide money as collateral. The theory is that if you have money on the line, you're more likely to return to court. But there is a major problem with that system. Money, specifically. Whether you have any. Because the ability to go home before trial can effectively depend on how much cash you have available. And bail hearings can be remarkably brief. Consider a hearing in Dallas involving a woman charged with felony theft. The hearing consisted of the judge setting bond at $5,000. That's it. The entire proceeding was so short that you could almost fit it into an Instagram story. And this wasn't necessarily unusual. Bail hearings can last only a few minutes. Sometimes there is no defence attorney present, and sometimes the process becomes astonishingly petty. Take a 2016 hearing in Harris County, Texas. A woman had been charged with misdemeanor possession of less than 2 ounces of marijuana. The judge asked whether she wanted a court-appointed lawyer. She said, "I guess." The judge demanded a yes or no. She said yes in the way human beings frequently say yes. Yeah, the judge wasn't satisfied. He demanded a yes or no. She said yeah again, and then he increased her bond, because apparently yeah had become a legally significant act of rebellion. First of all, yeah means yes. It's not as though she responded with a shrug, winked, and disappeared through a trapdoor. The judge knew exactly what she meant. But the bigger problem is what happens when you don't have enough money to pay. You may have to turn to a bail bondsman. The business model is straightforward. The bondsman pays the bail for you in exchange for a fee, usually around 10%, and that fee generally doesn't come back to you, regardless of what happens in your case. It is a massive business, roughly $2 billion a year, and almost none of that money appears to have been spent improving the advertising, because some bail bond commercials look like rejected music videos. It is not exactly the direction I would have taken for the Barbie movie, but perhaps that's just me. If you cannot afford bail and cannot afford the bondsman's fee, you stay in jail. And that produces one of the most disturbing facts in this entire debate. The number of people in local jails has risen dramatically over the past couple of decades. But when you look at who is driving that increase, there is something surprising. People with convictions levelled off around 1999, much of the increase came from people who had not been convicted. Every day in the United States, nearly 500,000 people in local jails have not been convicted of anything. Roughly 2/3 of the jail population on any given day consists of people who have not been convicted. And many of those people are there because they could not afford to buy their way out. That is an extraordinary thing to accept as normal. We are holding people in terrible conditions before they have been convicted simply because they don't have enough money. And it means an arrest can destroy someone's life even before a trial happens. Take Marvin Mayfield. He was arrested for a burglary he insisted he did not commit. He spent nearly 11 months at Rikers. Before that, he had a job, he had a home, he had a car. After 11 months, those things were gone. The job was gone. The car was gone. The place he lived was gone. And then came something even more devastating. He pleaded guilty, not because he said he was guilty, because he wanted to go home. After 11 months, he was offered a choice. Fight the case and remain incarcerated, or plead guilty and receive time served. He chose to go home, but that meant accepting a felony conviction for something he maintained he had not done. And when he explained the decision, it was devastatingly simple. The hardest part was pleading guilty to something he didn't do, just to stop the suffering. And honestly, I understand the temptation. If you keep someone locked up for 11 months without a trial and then tell them they can go home today if they plead guilty, eventually the system isn't simply asking whether they're innocent. It's asking how much suffering they can tolerate. After 11 months in Rikers, I might confess to anything. The Lindbergh baby. Me, JFK. Me, the Zodiac killer. Also me. Please just let me go home. And yes, I can already hear the objection. There is resemblance. But no, I look nothing like the Zodiac killer, and you will agree with me if you know what's good for you. The larger problem is that pre-trial detention can give prosecutors enormous leverage. If you're sitting in jail, losing your job, losing your apartment, losing contact with your family, and watching your life collapse, the prospect of accepting a plea deal can become incredibly powerful. Cash bail, therefore, isn't just about whether someone can get out of jail. It can shape the entire trajectory of their case. And then there are the racial disparities. Put all of that together and you can understand why so many jurisdictions pursued reform. Some even did so with bipartisan support. In 2014, New Jersey passed legislation that eventually cut the number of people in its jails roughly in half. And one of its prominent supporters was Chris Christie. Yes! That Chris Christie, the man who supported bail reform despite a political career that included some extremely memorable decisions. The man who had been photographed enjoying a beach that had been closed to the public during a government shutdown. The man who once became associated with traffic congestion in a way that seemed almost enthusiastically anti-traffic, and yet on this issue he supported reform. He made the argument that people shouldn't remain jailed longer than they would have been sentenced simply because their families couldn't come up with a few $100s. And that is an important point, because once you understand the system, the supposed relationship between money and danger becomes difficult to defend. A person charged with a minor offence who has no money can remain behind bars. Someone accused of something much more serious who has plenty of money can potentially go home. That is not necessarily a public safety system, it is a wealth test. And yet, the backlash against bail reform has been fierce. The argument always sounds roughly the same. If you eliminate cash bail, violent criminals will be released onto the streets. But that statement hides several important distinctions. A huge number of people in jail are there for misdemeanors or non-violent offences. Even violent felonies is an enormous category that includes circumstances ranging from murder to involvement in a fight. And perhaps most importantly, being charged is not the same thing as being guilty. That's what a trial is for, yet politicians sometimes blur that distinction. Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot did this when discussing pre-trial release programs in Cook County. She argued that people charged with violent crimes shouldn't simply be allowed to walk free. And then she said something much more troubling. She said that when charges are brought, those people are guilty. But then she immediately acknowledged that they are entitled to a presumption of innocence and a day in court. Those two ideas cannot coexist. You cannot simultaneously say someone is guilty and entitled to be presumed innocent. That's like saying you're simultaneously hungry and full, or tall and short, or British and happy. One of those things has to go, and the political fight became even more intense in Illinois as the state prepared to eliminate cash bail statewide. Republicans attacked the measure as the Purge Law. Some campaign mailers were designed to look like newspapers. They included photographs of men, many of them black or Latino, and suggested they would be released under the new system. The implication was clear: dangerous criminals were about to be unleashed, but the claims were misleading. The law did not require murder suspects to be released. Serious and violent offences could still result in pre-trial detention when someone was considered a public safety risk or a flight risk. So the reality was far more complicated than the mailers suggested, and that is precisely the problem. Once a debate becomes an emotional battle between public safety and criminals being released, there is very little room left for the actual policy. And the emotional argument is incredibly powerful because nobody wants to see another victim of crime. Nobody should. If someone is harmed by a new offence while awaiting trial, that is terrible. But public policy cannot be built entirely around the most emotionally frightening example available. Otherwise, every isolated tragedy becomes proof of whatever political argument you already wanted to make. And that's exactly what happened in New York. New York's bail reform law took effect on January 1, 2020. 8 days later, state legislators were already calling for it to be repealed. 8 days. Not 8 months, not 8 years, 8 days. One legislator said people were becoming scared. Another promised they were going to hammer the issue every day. And that raises an obvious question. What data were they using? Because 8 days is not enough time to determine whether a major criminal justice reform has caused a change in crime. Unless, of course, your New Year's resolution was become terrified of bail reform. And somehow you managed to stick with it past January 3rd. The truth is that violent crime did rise in New York in 2020, but it rose across America in places with bail reform and places without it. Despite that, the New York Police Department repeatedly connected bail reform to rising crime and gun violence. Its commissioner, Dermot Shea, repeatedly made the connection publicly. But when the New York Post examined those claims using NYPD data, the numbers did not support the sweeping narrative. During the first 6 months of 2020, there were 528 shooting incidents. Exactly one had been committed by someone released under bail reform. One. That doesn't mean bail policy can never affect crime. It means you cannot honestly look at that number and claim that bail reform was obviously driving the shootings. But the story got even stranger. Shea appeared on a local morning programme and discussed a suspect in a purse-snatching case. He said the man had 11 open court cases. 11? That sounds alarming. 11 open cases certainly sounds like the kind of statistic designed to make viewers sit up straight. But there was one small problem. The man was already in Rikers when the purse-snatching happened. He wasn't out because of bail reform. He was already incarcerated, so the wrong person had effectively been used as evidence for an argument about people being released from jail. 2 days later, Shea appeared before the state legislature, and suddenly the certainty disappeared. When asked whether people had been released without bail and then arrested for another shooting, he couldn't produce a dramatic number. He acknowledged that when you look at the total number of shooting arrests, the percentage was not dramatic. Not dramatic! That's important, because this was the same official who had repeatedly argued on television that bail reform was driving shootings. And yet, when forced into a setting where the numbers mattered, the language became considerably more cautious. Then 2 months later, he was back on television. Was bail reform leading to more shootings? His answer, 100%. No doubt. Absolutely. And there it is. Not dramatic, 100%. Those two claims don't fit together very well. The only place where not dramatic and 100% can comfortably coexist is in Kristen Stewart's general vibe. She's giving it everything she's got and somehow giving us absolutely nothing. The consequences of these conflicting claims were significant. Public support for bail reform dropped sharply. New York lawmakers rolled back parts of the law. And that's the danger, because fear is incredibly effective at changing public opinion. If you repeatedly show people crime scenes, body bags, angry politicians and photographs of defendants, you don't need to explain the actual mechanics of pre-trial detention. You just need people to feel afraid. And once they're afraid, a complicated statistical question becomes incredibly simple. Do you want dangerous people on the street? Well, obviously not. But that's not actually the question. The real question is, what system best protects the public while also respecting the rights of people who have not been convicted? Those are not mutually exclusive goals, and if you genuinely care about public safety, you have to count everyone as part of the public, including the accused, because cash bail was never the only thing standing between society and dangerous people. If someone has enough money, they can already go home. The person with money is not necessarily safer than the person without it. Because they're simply wealthier. Imagine a system where one person charged with a minor marijuana offence stays in jail because they cannot afford $2,000, while someone accused of a much more serious offence can remain at home because they have the money. That doesn't look like a safety system. It looks like a vending machine, impressed money, that excites freedom. And there is growing evidence that bail reform does not produce the crime wave opponents have predicted. An analysis covering studies from 7 different jurisdictions found that none showed a meaningful increase in crime caused by bail reform. Other research has suggested that unnecessarily jailing people can actually increase the likelihood of future arrest. That makes intuitive sense. If you keep someone from working, destabilise their housing, separate them from family, and expose them to jail conditions before they have even been convicted, you're not necessarily making it easier for them to build a stable life afterward. You're making it harder. In Harris County, Texas, researchers found that after cash bail was drastically reduced in misdemeanor courts, new prosecutions declined by 6% during the 3 years following arrest. That is not what the traditional political narrative would lead you to expect. But statistics don't make particularly exciting television. You can't put a number on screen and make people feel the same way they feel when they see a crime scene. You can't create a terrifying political ad that says, "Do you feel safe?" You should. Study after study shows bail reform has not been linked to increased crime. Arrest rates remain stable or slightly declined. Also, this body is actually 70 pounds of ham shaped like a man. It's accurate, it's honest, but it doesn't quite have the same emotional punch. And the important thing is that bail reform doesn't mean judges are powerless. In most states, judges can consider public safety and the likelihood that someone will fail to appear in court when making pre-trial decisions. New York has its own rules, but dangerousness has historically been part of how judges approached bail there as well. So the real debate isn't between release everyone and lock everyone up. There are many possible systems. New Jersey offers one model. Under its system, judges don't start by asking, how much money does this person have? Instead, the system uses information about things such as convictions, rather than simply arrests or socioeconomic status. A defendant receives a risk score related to the likelihood of reoffending or failing to appear. And if prosecutors want to detain someone with a high score, they have to seek a detention hearing and present evidence. That approach is not perfect. Computer algorithms can have biases of their own. One system in Broward County, Florida, was found to falsely flag black defendants as future criminals at almost twice the rate of white defendants. So congratulations, we've managed to invent the racist computer, which, if history is any indication, is probably worth several $billion once Elon Musk hears about it. The point isn't that New Jersey has solved everything. It hasn't. The point is that there are multiple ways to create a system that prioritizes public safety without making someone's bank account the deciding factor in whether they remain behind bars. New York has tried one approach, Harris County has tried another. New Jersey has taken a different route, and in each case, reforms have resulted in fewer people behind bars without the dramatic public safety collapse that opponents predicted. But there is another part of this debate that is much harder to discuss. What happens to the people who remain incarcerated before trial? Because the consequences can be enormous. You can lose your job, you can lose your home, you can lose contact with your family, and sometimes you can lose your life. An investigation of more than 500 American jails found that between 2008 and 2019, there were more than 7,500 inmate deaths. Nearly 5,000 of those people had never been convicted of the charges for which they were being held. In New York City, Rikers Island has been especially devastating. 17 people had died there that year at the time this story was told. And that brings us to the part of this subject that is hardest to shake, Khalif Browder. When we covered bail years earlier, we had planned to include his story. He was 16 years old when he was arrested for allegedly stealing a backpack. He said he was innocent. His family could not afford the $10,000 bail, and he remained at Rikers. Months became years. He tried to take his own life several times. Eventually, the case was dismissed. No conviction, no apology, no explanation that could possibly restore what had been taken from him. He had lost years of his life. He missed prom. He missed graduation. And he understood exactly what that meant. Those were years he would never get back. when we were preparing that earlier segment, we had intended to use an interview with him. Then, just before taping, we learned that he had died by suicide the night before. The clip was removed, and his death wasn't included in the tally of people who died at Rikers. But emotionally, morally, it is difficult to separate what happened to him from the system that had held him there. He had been arrested as a teenager. He had not been convicted. He spent years incarcerated because his family couldn't afford bail. And eventually, the case disappeared. The damage did not. That's the part that gets lost when the debate becomes a political shouting match. There are real victims on every side. There are people who commit crimes. There are people who are wrongly accused. There are victims who deserve justice. There are communities that deserve safety. And there are people who haven't been convicted who can nevertheless lose almost everything simply because they cannot afford to wait outside jail for their day in court. So where do we go from here? Hopefully not backward. A sensible system could begin with some basic principles. First, for people charged with low-level offences, freedom before trial should be the starting point rather than incarceration. Second, if a bail hearing is necessary, it should actually be a hearing, not 10 seconds, not a price announced from behind a desk, a real hearing. And people should have lawyers present. That shouldn't be controversial. Honestly, the fact that these things have to be said out loud is astonishing. Third, if someone is detained before trial, the system should move quickly. If you're going to take someone's freedom before they've been convicted, the least you can do is not make them wait years for a court date. None of this means reform is easy. It isn't. Reasonable people can disagree about the best risk assessment methods. They can disagree about detention standards. They can disagree about how judges should evaluate public safety. Those are legitimate debates, but we cannot have them while the entire conversation is dominated by fear-mongering advertisements, fake newspapers, sensational headlines, and confident statements that don't match the underlying data. And that is the real danger. Not that we will disagree, but that we will stop asking questions. Because once you convince people that someone who has merely been accused is already guilty, the presumption of innocence becomes meaningless. Once you decide that freedom belongs only to people who can afford it, civil liberties become something you technically possess but practically cannot use. And if you are going to lock someone away after conviction, that is already an enormous exercise of state power. Doing it before conviction is an even more serious responsibility because the person you're holding might be guilty or they might not be. And the entire purpose of a trial is to determine which. A system that forgets that distinction becomes a people-wrecking machine. It wrecks jobs, it wrecks homes, it wrecks families, it wrecks futures. And in the worst cases, it can wreck lives that never should have been destroyed in the first place. So if we're going to reform bail, let's do it carefully. Let's do it based on evidence. Let's protect the public. Let's protect victims. Let's make sure judges have the tools they need to detain genuinely dangerous people. But let's also remember the person standing in front of the judge who has not yet been convicted, because that person is part of the public too. And if we genuinely believe in civil liberties, they cannot be privileges reserved for people who happen to have enough money. Otherwise, they're not really liberties, they're luxury goods. And that's a terrible thing to sell as justice. And now, unnecessary full disclosure. All Tamron Hall edition. Full disclosure, my dad was 25 years older than my mom. Growing up, people sometimes thought he was my grandfather and my mom was his daughter. Full disclosure, I cannot stand push-ups. Full disclosure, I do dye my hair, and apparently I will dye it tonight. Full disclosure, my name is Tamron and I suffer from really dry feet. Full disclosure, in my home we eat maybe 2 burgers a week. Full disclosure, I've not eaten all day. Full disclosure, I drink wine, champagne, Prosecco and vodka. Full disclosure, I do not have a secret talent. Full disclosure, I don't know how comfortable I am talking about sex on television. Full disclosure, I have a Peloton. Full disclosure, I have a tattoo. Full disclosure, I know nothing that's happening on this show. And honestly, after everything we've just discussed, I think that might be the healthiest confession of the evening. That's our show. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next week. Good night.